Welcome back to the Band Guide, where we use GarageBand to create professional sounding music. I'm your band guy, Colin, and today I want to share with you the worst thing you can do with your plugins. And it's kind of sneaky, but if you don't realize that it's happening, you could crush your mixes. You could ruin the chances of a good mixes, because what we're doing here is actually tricking our ears into thinking we're making something sound better. You'll see what I mean in just a minute. So the way I want to demonstrate this to you is that I've created 3 tracks. They're all completely identical. So if we look through this, we have 3 drummer tracks. So this is just the standard retro rock drummer track that you create anytime you make a new drummer track. And all the settings are the same, and we have 1 EQ. That's the only plugin that's on any of these tracks. So if you look through these tracks, it's exactly the same for each of these tracks. And I want to start by just playing a little bit of this for you and letting you hear how this sounds, and then we'll jump to the next track and listen to how it sounds, and then we'll jump to the next track and listen to how it sounds. Note as we're going through how they sound similar, how they sound different. Pay attention to the kick and the snare, how punchy the kick is, how much the snare cracks, and see if you can kind of figure out what's going on sonically with these 3 tracks. So we'll just start with the first track here. Interesting, right? Did you hear that? There's definitely a difference going on here. So what I'm hearing, this first one sounds a little bit flat, a little bit lifeless. The second one is a little bit punchier. The snare kind of cracks through a little bit better. This third one, that kick has a lot of depth to it. It's really punchy. The snare cracks through a lot. Listen to it one more time and pay attention to those things on each of these tracks. Interesting, right? So what's the difference? We just have 1 EQ on here. So is the EQ different? Let's take a look at the EQs. Is the EQ different? So for the first track, this is the second track, this is the third track. These EQ settings are identical. So what's the difference? It's volume. That's the only difference here between these tracks is volume. If you look on the EQ, the output volume over here has been set slightly differently on each of these plugins. It might not seem like a lot, but this is actually super important because this output volume doesn't change the sound of the EQ. It changes how we perceive it because our ears tend to prefer anything that sounds louder. We pick up a little bit more on the low end, we pick up a little bit more on the high end. But that's not an EQ change. There's nothing different, as we see, at all between these 3 EQs. These EQs are identical. So what our ears are actually picking up is just more volume. And volume should be addressed in volume, not with EQ. It makes it really hard for us to assess, is this better? Is this EQ making this sound better, or is it just making it louder? So if you want to set your EQ to sound really great, or your compressor to sound really great, you need to balance the volume on the output so that you can accurately assess, is this EQ making my source sound better, or is it making it louder? Even just adding a few little boosts in here, these are just kind of smallish boosts, they're not crazy. We could be throwing off how we perceive this. We could be tricked into thinking that sounds better because each of these is adding a little bit of volume as well. So we need to balance our volume on the output here. So if we zero in on this track we've balanced down to -2. So when we listen to this track in solo and I bypass this EQ, it's about the same volume, but I can tell now, okay, that's adding a little bit of punch to the kick, a little bit of a crack to the snare, and it's not adding volume, it's just the EQ working. Now take that, let's go to the second example here. With this example, I've not done anything, but I just didn't turn my EQ back down, my volume output down. So now this track, if we solo it, huge difference. But part of that difference is this volume. It's not actually the EQ, what the EQ is doing in terms of how it's processing it. And then the third here, if we go down to this one, all we've done on this one is we've done a slight boost here. So this one, it's getting some boost through the EQ moves, but then also over here on this output. I mean, if you were to bypass it, you'd be like, oh no, it's ruining my drum sound. It's not ruining your drum sound. This EQ is doing nothing different here as it was on this track. It's super important that you realize this as you're setting your plugins, that you don't accidentally trick your ears into thinking it sounds better. We can actually do the converse of this. If we just turn this way down and then listen to it, oh man. I don't know, I like the way it sounds better with it off now, right? Because it's quieter, not because our EQ isn't any good. So your output volume setting is super important. You have an output volume setting on anything that could be affecting the volume of your signal. So you have it on your EQ, you have it on your compressor. A compressor is going to be turning down signal when it gets too loud. So you'll naturally be losing a little bit of volume with your compressor anytime it engages. So you want to make up that volume on the output so that it never gets louder. Now, an important note about the compressor is that the presets in here, some of these presets are going to do something called auto gain, which is basically trying to bring it back to a set volume once the compressor engages. Now, this is often actually going to add volume inside your compressor, so this output gain, we're not going to see it, but it will be louder once we've thrown that setting on. So sometimes you actually need to balance your compressor setting by turning the volume down if you have one of these presets on. If you're just on the stock standard setting, it's not doing that, so listen for how it's turning the signal down and then make up the gain until it sounds like it's the same volume. Then you can perceive what your compressor is doing. Same thing with your EQ. Then you can perceive what your EQ is doing. Now, this is super important for a lot of reasons, but one reason that we haven't even touched on here is that if you took time to set your volumes appropriately, like we've talked about in my 6 steps to a pro mix, and then you start adding volume on individual channels with EQ, with compression, or taking away volume with EQ or compression. If you're doing big cuts with your EQ, you're going to lose some of that volume. Then you might throw off your static mix, and you might not actually even realize that you've thrown off your static mix, and now all of a sudden your mix is falling apart, it's not working anymore, even though you're following the steps in the right order. So this is hugely important if you want to get the best mix possible. You want to systematically work through your mix. You want to set your volumes, and you want to set your EQs, and you want to set your compression. And if you're throwing off that first step by adding or taking away volume on any of your plugins, then you could ruin your mix. And you heard the difference that it makes when you get more or less volume. So that mix that you spent time setting up, a huge part of why that was working or wasn't working was actually because of the volume levels of your individual tracks. So it's really important that you realize this, that you're intentional with this. This is a small thing, but it's a thing that's really crucial, especially while you're learning your tools and you're understanding how your tools work and what you can do with your tools. If you're accidentally tricking your ears into thinking a plugin is doing something that it's not because you're either making it louder or making it quieter and not realizing it, then it's going to be harder for you to learn. It's going to be harder for you to get your head around how you're shaping your sound. At the end of the day, mixing is really just a combination of setting your volumes correctly, your panning correctly, setting your EQ levels to balance everything and make everything fit together, setting your compression so that everything is full and punchy and never too loud and never too quiet, and then setting effects that sound good to your ears. There's only 6 steps to mixing, as you know, if you follow me on this channel. And if you're serious about creating a professional sounding mix in GarageBand, I want to give you something to help with that. I've put together a 6-step checklist that walks through exactly what the 6 steps are in all professional mixes and how you can do them inside GarageBand right now, completely free. There's a link in the description below where you can go download it, again, completely free, so be sure to go grab that. Before we go, I want to hear from you. Do you think you've been doing this in your mixes? Are you intentional about balancing your volumes, or do you think you might have accidentally been adding or taking away volume in your plugins and not even realizing it? Let me know in the comments below. If this video is helpful, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next week with another video.
One thing at a time.